people have been talking about some things, especially in the NFL world, man, when it comes to minority coaches. So this past week there was a report coming out that the NFL is proposing a new minority rule. So everybody's familiar with the Rooney Rule. Rooney Rule states that, each team, when they're going through the hiring process of coaches or GMs, they mandatorily have to interview at least one minority candidate. Now, when you look at the success of the Rooney Rule, people are viewing it right now as kind of, I don't want to say a failure, but it's not really good when you look at the amount of NFL teams there are versus the amount of minority coaches. And when you're looking at the way that some of the people had presented why they were going in different directions, at first they kept saying that the reason why we hired this guy as a head coach because he had coordinator experience. But then after a while, it started becoming that these guys didn't even have to have coordinator experience. They were hiring quarterbacks coaches. They were hiring special teams coaches as head coaches, guys who haven't been in a head coach or coordinator role before were getting head coaching nods over minority candidates. Also at the GM position, similar concept, things like that. So this offseason, the NFL said, we got to do something to try to incentivize the hiring of minorities, to get a little more diversity in the NFL when it comes to head coaches and GMs, because I think right now it might be 4 active head coaches that are minorities with Ron Rivera, Mike Tomlin, Anthony Lynn, and who am I? I feel like I'm forgetting one person. Jeez. Might be one person I'm forgetting. Maybe.
3 or 4.
At tops.
There you go. Yeah.
So when you factor in all of that, and then from a GM standpoint as well, it wasn't looking really good in terms of a diversity, in terms of, having multiple ethnicities represented in the coaching ranks in terms of head coaches and GMs. Now, there are a ton of minority position coaches, but not the head coach or GM status. So what the NFL said they were going to do is, or what they're proposing is, if you hire a minority head coach, then once he's the coach for 2 years, going into that second season, your team in the third round will move up 6 spots in the draft. So if you were picking 10th in the third round, you will move up to the 4th spot. Okay. So just to put it in context for the third round. Then they also said that if you hire a minority GM going into that second year, you move up 10 spots in that third round. So obviously if you're picking at 10, you'll be picking at 1 in the third round. And then they said, if you hired a minority GM and a minority head coach in the same year, and they stayed on for 2 years, whether you're moving up 16 spots in the third round, which is very, very significant. We already know the difference of a player between the first pick in that round versus the 16th pick in that round. Yeah. So those are some of the things that they're proposing the NFL does in terms of incentivizing organizations to hire minorities in these more prominent roles. So I guess I'll go first. I like the gesture in terms of them trying to figure out ways to get more minority coaches, to get more diversity in that element. I do think that it's something that needs to be done in terms of finding ways to bring more diversity like that, because it's, when you look at the NFL and how it's represented from a minority standpoint, the minorities are the majority when it comes to the player ranks. But when it comes to the coach ranks, is drastically different. It's less than what 1-2% maybe in terms of minority coaches or GMs in those roles. So I definitely think that is something that needs to be addressed. In terms of the method, I still got mixed feelings on it. Like, I understand you want to make it extremely sweet, right? You want to make this deal just so beautiful that if you're the owner, you're saying, you know what? Yeah, we're taking this guy. But then at the same time, I'm hesitant on it because I feel like it would cheapen the move. If I bring you on, now it's going to come off as I'm only doing this so I can get these draft picks or move up in the draft. And that's it. Not because you're qualified. And that was my biggest issue with it, because I think that's how it is going to come off, especially that first go round when they first do these hires. If this rule gets passed, because like I said, the NFL has proposed it and they haven't voted on it just yet. But if it were to get passed, I think that first set of coach or GMs that are minorities that do get hired, that's going to be they only hired them because of this. And then, that's all they're going to talk about in the third round of that draft when they get moved up. Look at it right here, man. And it's almost like this is my token minority right here. And I just feel some type of way about that part.
Definitely. Because at the end of the day, you just want to pick the best guy.
Right.
And you're hoping me coming in from a fan's perspective, seeing some of the stuff that's been going on, even back this offseason when people were talking about some of the coaches were getting hired and like Eric Bieniemy wasn't getting hired, and like Stephen A. First Take talking about, hey, does NFL have a problem with hiring minority coaches?
Or even Louis Riddick. Louis Riddick
Right.
as a GM, I mean, people have raved about he's more than capable of doing the job, but you see guys with less experience getting the nod in there, and that's the thing. It's definitely unsettling.
And a lot of times, you'll sit back and say, I just hope they're picking the best candidate. That's how I've always thought this whole time.
Right.
So I think sometimes it comes across whenever the media and people are talking about it like deaf ears. Because I'm naive. I'm just thinking it's the best guy anyway. But I've had the privilege of having conversations with you, and you've kind of talking about just how things are structured. And I don't see that, but now my eyes are open a little bit, and now I'm like, all right, so there is a problem. Let's take that away and just say, all right, I hope the best coach, the best candidate is getting hired, but maybe that's necessarily not the case. Maybe I'm wrong in my perspective there. So how do we fix the problem? And I'm kind of with you that, man, is this necessarily the best way? It almost has the reverse effect, I think.
I agree, man. And I said to myself, okay, I don't know which part would be worse. You pass the rule and you hire somebody, and then they just keep pumping it that this is the only reason why this guy was hired, undermining everything that he's more than qualified to do. Or you get the side where they're like, we're not about to switch up and start hiring these guys, or we're not even going to pass this. And now it makes you think back to, well, man, we all can agree that there is a large disparity in terms of minority coaches and GMs, but by you voting this down, are you essentially saying that there's not a problem right now? Because then it kind of goes back to the same thing we're talking about. Okay, we're all going to just supposed to turn a blind eye or be naive to the fact that when you look on paper, there is an issue right here. So that's the thing for me, man. I think is so unique about the situation.
Right. And I was looking up some people, like analysts and whatnot, they were given suggestions, and there were some that saying like, players should say, I'm not going to this team because if you look at the percentages of hires that they've made, they don't have enough minority hires there. But then at the same time, if you're going to go out there and make a stand like that, that's saying the people, just because of the people they have in the organization is making their hires based off of race, and you can't really prove that. There's a lot of gray there.
It definitely is.
So putting that reputation on a team, it's like, all right, I don't know if that's the best strategy either. And then I was hearing something about making coaching more incentivized, where you do have 72, 73% of players in the league that are minorities, mostly black. Like there should be more incentive for them to get into coaching, but then we just prefer that there's a lot of assistant coaches and position coaches that are black. So I didn't think that really made too much sense either. Louis Riddick was saying something. Did you watch that video?
No, I
didn't.
That
there should be almost like job fairs, conferences, because one of the things is that it's just probably a matter of fact that most of the players, actually we're not really talking about players, but position coaches that are minorities, or even just people that are trying to get into coaching that are minorities, they don't have the same upbringing as the people making decisions, like the owners and GM. The majority of them, because I think all the owners in the league are white, correct?
Yes.
So
what's up, Shad Khan Jackson?
Okay. Yeah. So that is like a familiarity thing that is probably a big reason as to why these coaches aren't getting hired. And you want to point to, man, could it be the race thing? But then in the back of or at the end of the day, I think you're just going with who you're more familiar with in terms of background and that type of stuff.
Even the background part of it, sure, but I know a lot when it comes to the coaching hiring element. A lot of it is more familiarity. Like when you listen to some of these coaches, like when they're hiring their staff, they're like, yeah, I've worked with this guy here multiple times, or I've been with this guy multiple times. Some of these coaches and GMs have known each other from, okay, well, this GM, he was, in this department prior to that, we had interactings. And then from there, they already built a relationship. So I know that does play into it. And I mean, that's just in life in general. You want to hire people that you're more comfortable with, that you're more familiar with. But I think the biggest the biggest issue right now is just when you're basing it off that criteria. I think if every hire was like that, that's one thing. But when you're starting to see guys who don't even have relationships, I was going to say
that's the thing. That's the thing we don't know. We're just assuming with that. Correct. But then because
there have been situations where there was no familiarity, there was no relationship, and guys were getting hired. And first, like I said, they always a coordinator. He was a quarterbacks coach. That was the big thing. But then when you see guys who are special teams coach, guys who are receivers coaches getting head coaching nods, you're like, whoa. I mean, this dude right here is proven in the NFL what he can do as a head coach. Or he was highly successful as a position coach, but he's not even, I mean, when you look at how they'll interview one guy, but they already have made the hire essentially like the next day. Like they already have the little, hey man, I got you. We're going to do, but we have to do this first before I can hire you type thing. It doesn't really come off as genuine in terms of the practice that they're going about. But I mean, for me, first off, the fact that you got to have a rule. I mean, when you think about that, that's crazy.
Oh yeah.
But
right.
It is the way that, I mean, the world that we're living in and have lived in throughout these years. That is something. And a lot of people get uncomfortable when you talk that racial undertone and things like that. You can't say the R word. You can't say, why is I always got to play that card? But when you're just looking at the facts of it throughout the history of the NFL and the history of the country, it is something that is prevalent. And obviously it still is going on. So I do think it does need to be addressed, but I think I don't know if this is the correct way to go about it, you know?
Yeah, that is the question. How? Because it goes back to probably a lot of other stuff in society. It's more of a system thing. Because if you try to point at one team, one person, you can't really do that.
Correct.
Because one hire, this team hiring this person, you say, you didn't hire because of race. It's like, nah, I did it for this, and this reason. You can't really calculate that at all. Very true. So the system is in place. Because I bet you if you go to each team and say, because there's what we just talked about, 3 or 4 minority coaches. But if you went to each team that doesn't have a minority coach, and said, "Hey, was race a part in your head coach hiring process?" Well, everyone would say no,
not a chance. What? Who would admit that?
Yeah. Right. So
but I think, I was gonna say, I think less about asking is race the reason why, but more so, did you feel this guy was more qualified than this guy, and why? I think that's more the thing that I know from my perspective, because I don't mind, like you said, if guys are getting hired and they're more qualified, sure. But when we're talking about guys who have zero experience in that role versus another guy who's had a ton of success in a role, or a guy who's been just as successful or more successful in their position coach role, why is that difference like that? That's the thing that I'm more curious about in terms of how do you figure that out? I mean, because when it comes to trying to say race is the biggest reason why people aren't hiring people, that's like tough to prove.
Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about like really trying to say, hey, you aren't doing this because of that.
And I feel like that's a lose-lose whenever that's brought out, because you say that and then the person or the organization is like defensive. It's like, no, it's not the case at all. I didn't want this to be a part of any of the hiring process.
And from a league standpoint, it puts a black eye on that team and puts a black eye on the NFL.
Yeah.
So when it comes to that, it's very sensitive in terms of how you go about doing it, how you go about accomplishing it. And like I said, I understand you want more diversity. I definitely understand that part. But like I said, just the method is very unique in terms of how they're going to have to go about doing it. But I don't think you say, well, let's not change anything and just go status quo, because I don't necessarily think that's the best move either. But at the same time, I just feel like some people get frustrated by it, because when you look at, even when you make the initial hire, right? Say you go a person that's not a minority, their leash seems so much longer in terms of they're able to have multiple seasons of underwhelming performances. We've seen it in the league. We talk about it all the time. Man, that organization sucks. They keep those coaches down for too long. But then you look on the flip side with minority coaches, historically, their leash is a lot shorter. Even when they're highly successful, their leash is a lot shorter. And that's something that always makes people bring that back up, like, well, why is that? Why is it that this guy can have one bad season, you want to fire him, but this guy over here has been there for 3 years and it's been trash, but it's okay though. Like those are some of the things that make people bring that up even more so in that regard.